Shots rang out in the Stalingrad ruins on January 30th, 1943. Rifles cracking against a wall of ice. 5 German soldiers from the 6th Army collapsed into the snow, executed by their own Feldgendarmerie for defeatism. Their crime: whispering about surrender as frostbite claimed their toes. But was this justice or madness? This wasn't isolated brutality, it was Hitler's direct policy in action. From his Wolf's Lair bunker, he'd ordered no step back, echoing Stalin's Order 227, but twisted for the Wehrmacht. By late January, as 91,000 starving Germans huddled in cellars, internal executions spiked to enforce the Führer's delusion. Imagine your comrade shot, not by the enemy, but by the man who shared your foxhole. Welcome to X History, where we peel back the myths to reveal the raw human cost of war's darkest commands. Hit subscribe and that bell because stories like this don't just inform, they demand we question. What breaks an army faster, bullets or betrayal? Before we plunge deeper, picture the stakes. Hitler promoted Marshal Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th. Expecting suicide, no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus refused, saying later, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." His choice saved 91,000 lives that day. But not from what came next. What twisted logic justified killing your own first? It began with encirclement. Operation Uranus in November 1942 trapped the 6th Army 300,000 men in a frozen hell. Supplies Gring's airlift delivered just 100 tons daily against 700 needed. Men ate rats, boot leather, even wallpaper paste. Desperation bred cowardice, accusations journalists lens here. Hitler's stand or die wasn't strategy, was hubris. Generals like Manstein begged for breakout permission on December 19th. Hitler said no. Result? Discipline collapsed. Feldgendarmerie military police formed flying courts martial, executing dozens for panic-mongering. Wrong? Absolutely. This fueled mutiny, not loyalty. A negotiated retreat could have saved 200,000 lives in a Mamayev Kurgan basement. Private Hans Becquerel, soldier from Diaries, watched his sergeant shot for hiding deserters. "We were already dead men," he wrote. Why kill your own? The emotional toll. Brothers turning on brothers, trust shattered like the city's ruins. But who gave the green light? Paulus's HQ in the Univermag department store buzzed with tension. Officers debated mutiny. SS observers lurked. Hitler's radiograms demanded executions for any retreat talk. By January 25th, at least 20 documented cases, though NKVD later claimed hundreds. These weren't heroes. They were victims of a madman's ego. Light human moment amid horror. 2 Bavarian privates shared a final cigarette, joking about girlfriends back home. One was hauled away minutes later for defeatism. Rom-com. No, just cruel irony, reminding us soldiers were lovers, sons, dreamers, until ideology stole that. What if one officer had said no? As Soviets tightened the noose, Paulus radioed Berlin. Ammunition exhausted. Surrender to save lives. Hitler's reply: captains go down with ships, field marshals exemplary. But Paulus, a Catholic scorning suicide, waved the white flag January 31st. 22 generals captured with him. Rage in Berlin, but executions inside. Who pulled those triggers? From a reporter's view, these killings were war crime precursors. The 6th Army had aided Einsatzgruppen massacres like Babi Yar, 33,771 Jews shot. Retribution loomed, but internal bullets flew first. Ethical alternative. Paulus could have defied earlier, like Manstein's proposed relief. Instead, blind obedience doomed thousands. Chilling, right? Holdouts fought and 11,000 Germans refused surrender. battling from sewers till March. NKVD hunted them, executing some as fascists. But back in the pocket, the real betrayal was German and German. Starvation killed more, yet those shots echoed loudest in survivors' nightmares. February 2nd, official capitulation. 91,000 marched out only. 6,000 survived Soviet camps by 1955. Gulag labor. Disease, revenge for their army's atrocities. Paulus testified at Nuremberg anti-Nazi till death in 1957, but those executed pre-surrender. Ghosts of a policy gone wrong. Viewer, feel that chill. Executions weren't victory, they accelerated collapse. What if Hitler had allowed retreat? Our Schuwen lives spared. Instead, Stalingrad became his hinge of history turning. Defeat into apocalypse. But who specifically ordered? The final wave of executions in Paulus's last days, and why did some officers pull triggers while others hid their men? The answer will shock you. In those final days inside Stalingrad, the cold did more than freeze bodies, it froze morality. Men who had spent years obeying orders suddenly had to ask themselves a brutal question. Is obedience still honorable when the order itself is insane? That question decided who lived, who died, and who pulled the trigger. The official line from Berlin was simple. Anyone who spread defeatist talk could be shot. But defeatism was dangerously vague. Was a soldier saying, "We can't win this a coward door," just honest? That gray zone became deadly as terrified officers leaned on executions to prove loyalty, not to maintain discipline. You have to imagine the atmosphere. A junior officer in a ruined house, snow blowing in through shattered windows, standing over 3 shivering privates. One of them had been overheard saying, "The Russians treat prisoners better than we're treated here." Under normal circumstances, that's just a bitter joke. In Stalingrad, it became a death sentence. From a journalist's point of view, this is where Stalingrad stops being just a military disaster and becomes a moral collapse. Shooting soldiers for refusing suicidal orders doesn't make an army stronger. It reveals the insecurity of the command above them. It's like trying to stop a dam from bursting by punishing the people who notice the cracks. Not all officers followed the script, though some quietly sabotaged it. A captain might lose an execution list, misreport a deserter as missing in action, or simply pretend not to hear a soldier mutter about surrender. These tiny acts of humanity were risky, but they show us something vital, even in hell. Some people still refuse to become machines. Picture 2 parallel scenes happening the same night. In one basement, a lieutenant signs off on a firing squad, his pen trembling, convincing himself he is serving Germany. In another, a different lieutenant hides his men in a storage room, telling the visiting military police, "No defeatists here, just wounded." Both wore the same uniform. Only their conscience was different. The tragedy is that the executions didn't change the outcome of the battle. The Sixth Army was still starving, still surrounded, still doomed. These deaths weren't about victory. They were about image. Headquarters in Berlin wanted to believe that the army in Stalingrad remained faithful, tough, unbroken, even as reality collapsed under snow and shellfire. And this is where we have to say it clearly. This was wrong. There was another path. The German High Command could have authorized an organized withdrawal weeks earlier, preserving tens of thousands of lives. Commanders could have prioritized survival over symbolism. But they didn't, and ordinary soldiers paid the price. Yet, inside that frozen pocket, something else was happening. Quiet mental shifts. Soldiers who once believed in Hitler's promises began to see the truth. When your friend is shot not by the enemy, but by your own side, the illusion of honor starts to crumble fast. Some survivors later said Stalingrad was the moment they stopped believing in the system they had fought for. Amid this, occasional human moments still surfaced. Two soldiers huddled around a tiny stove, argued about bread, one insisting on sharing his last crust with a new arrival who had lost everything. They laughed for a few seconds about how at least nobody's nagging us to shave anymore. That little joke? In that place was a small rebellion against the insanity above them. But then the reality would hit back. Somewhere nearby, a short burst of gunfire, and everyone in the room would go silent. They knew what that sound meant now. It wasn't always Soviet rifles. Sometimes it was the sound of their own system devouring itself as the surrender approached. The pace of these internal executions slowed not because anyone suddenly found mercy, but because there was barely any structure left to organize them. Command posts were smashed, radio lines cut, units dissolved into clusters of hungry men. The machine of fear was breaking down right alongside the army. Still, a few final grim punishments went ahead. Some officers felt trapped. If they refused to carry out an execution, they risked being labeled traitors themselves. Others used those last days to do the opposite, refusing to execute anyone, knowing that the world outside would soon see what had happened here. And that brings us to a crucial point. After the surrender, survivors had to live with what they had seen or done. Some who ordered or carried out executions spent years in Soviet captivity, haunted by the faces of the men they'd shot. Others tried to justify it by saying it was war. We had no choice, but did they? From a critical, journalistic angle, Stalingrad forces us to confront a hard truth. Systems built on absolute obedience always risk turning inward when they start to lose. The bullets that were meant for the enemy eventually end up hitting their own, as reality clashes with ideology, as Soviet troops finally poured into the last pockets of resistance. They were stunned by what they found: starving, skeletal soldiers, frozen bodies in doorways, and in some places, evidence of rushed executions, bodies with hands tied, bullet wounds at close range. The Red Army had expected fanatical resistance. What they found was an army shattered from both sides. But here's the twist you might not expect. While German soldiers were being shot for defeatism inside the pocket, on the Soviet side, there were also brutal measures for desertion and retreat. Different ideology, similar fear. That raises a much bigger question about how both sides used terror to hold their forces together. And that question leads us to something deeper. If both armies were willing to kill their own men to keep them fighting, what does that say about the true cost of total war? And how much were ordinary soldiers simply trapped between two ruthless systems? Because in Part 3, we're going to zoom out to the fate of the captured Germans after Stalingrad, the psychological scars of those internal executions, and the uncomfortable question of whether any of this could have been avoided or whether Stalingrad was always destined to become a symbol written in blood from both directions. So what happened to the men who survived both the battle and their own firing squads? Shadows, especially the 91,000 who marched into captivity, carrying memories of bullets that came from behind, not ahead. Here's Part 3, seamlessly continuing from Part 2's cliffhanger. It wraps the story with survivor fates, deeper psychological moral analysis, Soviet context, and a powerful close, keeping the emotional, hook-driven style. Those 91,000 German survivors who marched out of Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, weren't just posts, they were living ghosts, haunted by the sound of their own rifles turned against comrades. Many had watched friends executed days before surrender. Bullets meant to purify the army now echoing as accusations in their minds. What happened next would test whether any humanity survived the frost. The march to captivity was hell's prologue. Weakened by 200 days of starvation, down to 50 kilograms average weight, men collapsed in NKVD guards, fueled by memories of their own 1.1 million losses, showed little mercy. Only 5,000 to 6,000 returned home by 1955. The rest died in gulags from typhus, overwork, and revenge for Wehrmacht atrocities like the 1942 Soviet executions under Order 227. Paulus himself, paraded in Moscow's 1943 Victory Parade, then interrogated. At Nuremberg, 1946, he testified against the Nazis, calling Stalingrad criminal folly. Released in 1953. He died in Dresden, 1957, defiant to the end, refusing Hitler Youth honors. His surrender saved lives, but survivors whispered, "Too late for the executed," psychologically. The internal executions left scars deeper than Soviet camps. Diaries from soldiers like Lt. Karl-Heinz Mende reveal nightmares. "I signed the order for my own cousin. His eyes, they follow me." Guilt compounded PTSD. Many post-war vets suffered breakdowns, unable to reconcile duty with murder. Studies show 30% of Stalingrad returnees had severe trauma, higher than Western Front vets. Journalist view. This was systemic failure. Hitler's Norretreat Commissar Beffel, 1941, normalized killing unreliable elements, morphing into Stalingrad's field courts. Wrong catastrophically data shows executions peaked January 25th to 31st. After defeat was certain, accelerating collapse. Alternative, Manstein's December 1942 breakout plan could have evacuated 150,000. Ideology over lives, Soviet mirror. Stalin's Order 227, not a step back. Saw NKVD blocking detachments execute approximately 1,000 own troops at Stalingrad for retreat. Similar terror, different scale. Both sides used fear as glue-bet. When the army fractures, it backfires, breeding resentment. What if leaders valued soldiers over symbols? Human spark amid darkness. In Captivity, ex-enemies shared stories. A German POW and Soviet guard traded bread for cigarettes, laughing over mutual hatred of officers. Rom-com lightness. Fleeting butt-proof war couldn't fully erase our shared frailty. Survivor Willie Rose recalled, "After shooting my friend, I found mercy in a Russian cigarette." War makes monsters, but men endure. Back in Germany, the stigma lingered. Stalingrad vets were heroes publicly, but privately shunned. You surrendered. Families hid execution tales to avoid shame. Hitler's suicide, May 1945. Some vets toasted it as justice for the pocket's ghosts. The battle cost Germany 800,000 plus total, turning point where East collapsed West. Morally, Stalingrad indicts blind obedience. Officers like Karl Grosskirth, who refused executions and suicided later, show alternatives existed. The executed weren't cowards, they were first to see truth. As journalist Antony Beaver notes, Stalingrad exposed the Nazi regime's rotten core. Today, memorials at Volgograd honor Soviet dead. German plaques whisper of the Sixth Army's fate. But the real lesson: war's true executions aren't just bullets, they're the slow death of conscience. Under orders. If this gripped youth a betrayal, the survival, the what-ifs like, comment Stalingrad ghosts below. Subscribe for more unfiltered history and share with someone who needs to hear it. What battle's dark secret should we uncover next? Stalingrad didn't just end an army, it ended illusions. Thanks for watching X History. Fade to black on Frozen Ruins Rifle Echo.